Hey guys, before we get into my next top 10 video, could you all do me a massive favour and head over to the Checkpoint Reach podcast on YouTube, where I was recently a guest on their most recent podcast. These were some really cool guys to sit down and have a chat with all the latest gaming news, and I'd love if you could go show them some support and give them a like. The link will be in the description. So if you watched my last video, you know that I'm doing things a little bit different. Instead of looking back at the past year of games, I'm looking back even further at the past decade. In the past decade, we have had quite a few bangers, but there have also been quite a few stinkers too. So without further ado, I'm TJFL. Make sure to subscribe if you're new to the channel, and also check out my Instagram too, where I post daily screenshots of the games I'm playing right now. This is my top 10 most disappointing games of the past decade. So, time to break some hearts. Number 10 is CYBERPUNK 2077. Releasing just this month, this game has made its mark in video gaming history, but unfortunately not the mark it was intended to strike. CYBERPUNK 2077 is an unfinished, broken mess of a potentially masterpiece game. Besides its obvious issues of bugs and crashes, the main character of the game, V, who is your main viewpoint to experience the world of Night City, is one of the most mundane and uninteresting characters I have ever played. Couple that with spongy enemies and an overcomplicated RPG system, CYBERPUNK 2077 falls short of everyone's expectations and is most definitely the most disappointing game of 2020. Number 9 is Ghost Recon's Breakpoint. I spent an unhealthy amount of time with its predecessor, Ghost Recon Wildlands, despite it being a distinct step away from the original Ghost Recon series. The military simulation open world of Wildlands was one I spent countless hours in and had tons of replayability, especially with friends. Breakpoint looked to fix the issues of Wildlands by being a more narrative driven experience with some light RPG mechanics to help further in-game progression. What we got was a very bland game with a boring narrative despite the best efforts of John Berthnell, and the RPG mechanics did nothing more than to incentivize us to spend money with in-game microtransactions. Breakpoint was a large open world of nothingness, with little personality, and seemed more like a poor man's Division. Hopefully the next sequel in the Ghost Recon's franchise will be a return to form, and in recent years Ubisoft has been a very responsive company, so I have faith that they'll pull this off. Number 8 is Deus Ex: Mankind Divided. I love the Deus Ex series, and Human Revolution set up a bright new future for this franchise. Instead, Mankind Divided felt more like an expansion to Human Revolution rather than a substantial sequel, and right as the story picks up, the game cuts to black and rolls the credits. It's not that this was a bad game, but ultimately, it did nothing to further the Deus Ex franchise and felt more as if the game was there to set up future games rather than being a compelling game in itself. Mankind Divided is responsible for putting one of my favourite franchises on ice, and that hurts deep. Number 7 is Assassin's Creed Odyssey. If you've watched me for a while now, you'll know how much this game triggers me, and I'm so grateful that Valhalla was thankfully a step away from Odyssey rather than a successor to it. Assassin's Creed Odyssey seek to gut the pre-existing lore from the franchise in an attempt to make this just another open world RPG game with spongy enemies and a repetitive and microtransaction orientated loot system. I hope this game is looked back on by most as a serious step in the wrong direction for the Assassin's Creed franchise. Number 6 is Crackdown 3. The Crackdown series was one of Microsoft's best exclusives for the Xbox 360 generation, and the anticipation for the third title in the series was unrivaled. With talks of the world being fully destructible and being the ultimate playground for you to run around as a Superman was every Microsoft fanboy's dream. Yet when the game launched, it lacked much of what was promised and was not much better than your average tie-in movie game. If you want a more in-depth opinion on Crackdown 3, make sure to check out my review. Number 5 is Mass Effect Andromeda. Prior to its launch, I think everyone was rather dubious as to whether BioWare could pull this off, especially without the main character of Commander Shepard to carry us through this story. Well, it turns out that our concerns were right, and Andromeda was a rather boring game, with uninteresting characters and a disengaging plot. Coupled up by the fact that the game was marred with technical issues at launch, Mass Effect Andromeda will always be remembered as the game that showed us that BioWare aren't miracle workers and can't always get it right. Number 4 is Star Wars Battlefront 2. Star Wars Battlefront 2 was the first game to hit headline news with its unethical use of microtransactions in a video game. With all the game's mechanics centered around incentivizing us to spend real world money in the game, Battlefront 2 was a monetary disaster. Since its launch, the game has been reworked and tons of content has been added for free. This past year I've actually put a lot of hours into the game, and it's definitely a game worth picking up now. But that doesn't change the fact that at launch, this game was predatory and unethical. But because of Battlefront 2, we have seen companies being much more wary of their use of microtransactions. Number 3 is Watch Dogs. When Watch Dogs was first shown to us at an E3 conference, it was touted as the GTA killer, with state-of-the-art graphics and a riveting open world to get lost in. What could go wrong in this new Ubisoft IP? Well, it turns out quite a lot could go wrong. The graphical downgrade at release made Watch Dogs look considerably worse than even last-gen games, and the overall gameplay was mediocre at best. I actually enjoyed Watch Dogs when it released, and have replayed it a few times since then, but I will never forget the absolute uproar at launch due to Ubisoft not setting our expectations for this game. Number 2 is none other than Anthem. Anthem was an absolute disaster, and was a nail in the coffin for our trust of the BioWare studio. The first signs of trouble began in its disastrous beta, which was riddled with bugs and an empty world, completely different to what we were shown at its E3 trailer. Anthem lacked content, and even to this day the game is a ghost town, with EA neglecting to give this game the attention it needs to make it worth jumping back into. Number 1 is of course No Man's Sky. No Man's Sky was the biggest lie in video gaming history. We were told countless lies of what we could do in this game, from being able to play with friends, to functioning ecosystems and wars taking place across the galaxy. Despite the scope of the game being true, the procedurally generated content was bland and uninspiring, leading to an overwhelming amount of distaste towards the No Man's Sky creator, Sean Murray. Since release, No Man's Sky has had an abundance of content added, and if you jump into this game now for the first time, there's definitely a lot to love, and it is a much better experience than it was at launch. But for me, no matter how many updates they do, I just can't rid the sour taste in my mouth of all the lies we were told at launch. So that's my list for the top 10 most disappointing games of the past decade. What's yours? Make sure to drop your list in the comments below. I'm TJFL, I hope you all have a great new year, and I'll see you in the next one.